Today I stand before you to explore a concept that holds immense power, yet often with a misunderstanding so common. The idea that detachment means withdrawal from life. When people hear the word, they imagine distance, coldness, or a refusal to participate. Yet in the great Eastern traditions, Buddhist, Taoist, Hindu, detachment never meant disengagement. It was never an instruction to step away from experience. One may live a life that is rich, active, and deeply engaged, and yet remain detached in the proper sense. This does not mean acting mechanically or having one's mind elsewhere. It means complete participation, but without clinging. The difference lies in attitude. When one becomes anxious about experience, afraid of missing it or losing it, one grasps at it. And in grasping, one spoils it. Detachment, then, is not refusal of life, but freedom within it. Now, this distinction becomes clearer when we look at how pleasure actually works. There is a way of approaching experience with a kind of inner tension, an anxiety that says, I must not miss this, I must have it, I must hold on. And the moment that attitude appears, pleasure is already compromised. One grips too tightly, driven by the fear that satisfaction will somehow slip away. But pleasure cannot be forced. When it is pursued with desperation, it dissolves. Each attempt ends in disappointment, followed by a curious sense of emptiness, the feeling that something was promised but never quite delivered. And so one tries again and again. The repetition continues, not because pleasure was found, but because it never truly arrived. This compulsive cycle is precisely what is meant by attachment in its destructive sense. There is a simple image that makes this perfectly clear. Imagine a small child is given a rabbit and she is delighted, yet she is so afraid of losing it that she hugs it too tightly, and in her love she crushes it. The very thing she wished to preserve is destroyed by her fear. This is not unusual. Parents do it to children. Lovers do it to one another. We hold too hard, not realizing that life itself is fragile, fleeting, and alive only when allowed to move. To possess it completely, one must simultaneously let it go. Only then can pleasure be felt fully, freely, openly, without fear. So we arrive at a curious truth. To have pleasure, one must at the same time be willing to lose it. The fullness of experience only appears when there is no attempt to seize it. When one relaxes the grip, something quite unexpected happens. Pleasure is no longer thin or anxious, but rich, bodily, and whole. One's entire being is taken up by it, not in a strained way, but in a natural rolling movement, like a wave passing through. This can occur only when there is a willingness to be abandoned, to give oneself over without reservation. And it is strange how that word abandon troubles us, because we usually apply it to those who have gone astray. Yet the same word can describe a saint. There is a kind of holy abandon that comes from trust, not recklessness. This quality of abandonment is what is meant by being poor in spirit. It does not imply misery or deprivation. It means having no inner property to defend, nothing clutched tightly as mine. Such a person carries no unnecessary burdens. They are not hung up. They move lightly through experience, free to enjoy it, precisely because they do not demand that it remain. This willingness to let go is not an added virtue, it is essential. Without it, pleasure collapses into tension, and life becomes a continuous effort to secure what cannot be secured. With it, enjoyment arises naturally, without strain, because nothing is being forced to stay. It was this very problem that concerned the Buddha in his early life, the problem of human suffering, and he approached it in an extremely practical way. His teachings were designed to be remembered, organized into clear patterns, not as philosophy for debate, but as medicine for the human condition. He summarized his insight in what are called the Four Noble Truths. The first and most fundamental is the truth of dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, the sense that something is always slightly out of place. The second addresses its cause, and here the diagnosis is direct. Suffering arises from trishna, thirst, craving, the insistence on holding fast to a world that cannot be held. Now, this word trishna is often translated simply as desire, but that is a little too mild. It is better understood as craving, a thirst that insists, a grasping that refuses to release. It includes not only wanting things, but being psychologically stuck. When a person hesitates, blocks, or cannot move freely, that very rigidity is attachment. They are holding on to something, an outcome, an image, a certainty. And this is why suffering persists. One clings to what is changing and then resents it for changing. One demands permanence from a process. In doing so, the mind tightens and life feels obstructed. The suffering is not imposed by the world. It is generated by the grip. A Buddha, by contrast, is never stuck. He cannot be fazed. His mind flows in the same way that water flows. You may dam a river, but it does not panic. It simply rises, waits, and eventually passes over the obstruction. Its movement is inevitable, but never forced. This is the quality of liberation, not rigidity, but adaptability. The enlightened mind does not insist on a particular route. It responds, it moves. It yields where yielding is required, and advances where advancing is natural. Because it does not cling, it cannot be trapped. And because it does not resist, it cannot be defeated. At this point, the student usually encounters a difficulty. Having heard that desire is the cause of suffering, he makes a strenuous effort to get rid of desire. And almost immediately, he discovers that he is now desiring not to desire. He has merely shifted the object of craving. When this is pointed out, it can be rather embarrassing. But it reveals something essential. You cannot force non-attachment. To strive for freedom is already to miss it. The attempt to conquer desire becomes yet another form of clinging. And so the instruction is gently adjusted. Do not try to give up more desire than you are capable of relinquishing. This is why Buddhism is called the middle way. Not only because it avoids extremes of indulgence and austerity, but because it avoids excess even in renunciation. One does not demand perfection of oneself. One does not insist on total release all at once. If desire falls away, it falls away. If it remains, it is allowed to remain. There is no hurry. There is no struggle. Freedom is approached indirectly, by understanding rather than coercion. And in that absence of strain, something loosens of its own accord. Not because it was pushed, but because it was no longer being held. There is, in Taoism, a principle known as Wu Wei. It is often translated as non-action. But that can be misleading. It does not mean doing nothing, nor does it suggest passivity or laziness. The best way to understand Wu Wei is as not forcing. It is action that does not strain against the nature of things. We recognize this immediately in human activity. When a dancer, a musician, or an actor performs in a forced manner, we sense it at once. Something rings false. The movement lacks inevitability. It is artificial. And so, Wu Wei points to a kind of action that arises naturally, without inner resistance, because it is in harmony with the situation itself. This does not mean that force is never used. It means that force is used only at the right moment. In the practice of judo, for example, one does not struggle continuously against an opponent. Muscle is applied only when the other is already off balance, already overextended. At that precise moment, a very small effort produces a decisive result. The wisdom lies in timing. Shakespeare understood this perfectly when he spoke of the tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Miss the tide, and all effort becomes laborious. Catch it, and movement carries itself. Wu Wei is based on sensitivity to this drift, this natural momentum of events. Thus, Wu Wei may be understood as the art of sailing rather than the art of rowing. The sailor does not create the wind, he studies it, he adjusts the sail. He works with what is given, rather than exhausting himself in opposition. Rowing, by contrast, depends entirely on muscular effort. Sailing depends on intelligence, on awareness, responsiveness, and trust. In this sense, Wu Wei is not inactivity, but a deeper form of participation. One is not trying to dominate the current, but to cooperate with it. And paradoxically, it is this cooperation that allows one to go farthest. This same principle appears in the Taoist understanding of virtue. Laozi says that superior virtue does not attempt to be virtuous, and therefore truly is. Inferior virtue cannot let go of its virtue, and so it becomes artificial. When goodness is self-conscious, it stiffens. It becomes performance. But when action flows naturally from understanding, it requires no effort to be moral. It simply fits. True Wu Wei cannot be intentional in the usual sense. The moment one tries to be effortless, effort has already entered. And so the highest form of action leaves no trace of strain because no one is trying to act correctly at all. At this point, one begins to notice something rather important. You do not actually know what you want until you become quiet. As long as the mind is busy choosing, comparing, planning, and justifying, it is merely repeating habits. It is not listening. Genuine intention does not announce itself through effort. It reveals itself in stillness. When the noise subsides, there is a subtle signal, not a command, not a rule, but a direction, and it cannot be forced into appearance. The more urgently one tries to decide, the more confused one becomes. But when one waits without strain, action emerges on its own, appropriately, without argument. This is not indecision. It is a deeper intelligence at work, one that operates before thought interferes. This brings us to what the Chinese call the void. Not emptiness in the sense of absence, but space itself. Space is the condition that allows anything to exist at all.